Hi, everybody. Welcome to Attack with Larry C. I'm your host, Larry Christiansen. We're going to talk about Paul Keres, one of my favorite players. And I was going through some of his games, which I often do. And I think I came up with a couple nice little uh, vignettes from Paul Keres, the Estonian super grandmaster, one of the strongest players who was never world champion. And in my opinion, his games have a clarity and energy and common sense vision that I really appreciate. I can really relate to his games. Great attacking players as youth, wild and crazy. He became, he mellowed with age, of course, and became a proficient at all aspects of the game. And he was quite an expert on the Ruy Lopez, both sides, white and black. And today we're going to look at Paul Keres playing the white side of the Ruy Lopez closed variation, which is really a very rich, deep, interesting line. Um, you see play in action ranging across the board, queen side, center, and king side, and it's a lot of fascinating action. And here, his two opponents were also highly regarded experts in the Ruy Lopez. The late Svetozar Gligorich here is Keres' victim in our first game we will review. Here, let's get right to it. All right, there's the Ruy Lopez. And this now becomes the closed variation, as here Gligorich never liked the Marshall Gambit, which is popular today. He plays d6, and now we're in the closed Ruy. Keres plays the anti-pinning move h3, and now black. Gligorich now feints a Zaitsev variation, which would be rook e8. Instead, he now opts for knight a5. That unblocks the c pawn, and he's maneuvering the knight to the b6 square where it stands in. It's perfectly well placed there, and it supports black's counterplay, which is often involves a freeing move d6, d5. Now here, Gligo plays knight c4. He has other options, but this is perfectly logical. Keres drives him back. Knight b6. Knight bd2. And now black has various options. Knight fd7. Or the game continuation, which is knight bd7. Now this position is famous also because of the game Fischer-Stein, Seuss Interzonal 1967. That's where Bobby Fischer played b4 as a novel, employing that as a novelty. Stein then played e takes d4, c takes d4, giving up the center to create play on the queen side with a5. Fischer took on a5. Stein now goes hyperactive with c5, but came under a withering attack after e5, de5, de5, knight d5, knight e4, and while black owned the queen side and many of the squares around in the queen side, basically white's entire army, excepting that rook, is trained on black's king. And Fischer won a very fine and famous game. Seuss, 1967. But here, Gligorich plays Keres plays bishop b2. Quiet, useful move, but probably not as good as b4. Okay, Gligo now expands, and here are our next few moves. White could have considered d5, probably a little more accurate. Rook e8. Now this is very characteristic of Keres and of the closed Ruy. White plays a4 to create a target, put the rook into play, but primarily to keep a target and to keep black busy on the queen side. He keeps black busy on the queen side. White can then create opportunities in the center and the king side. Okay, bishop f8 and knight g3. Again, knight d5 was perfectly reasonable idea. Queen c7, and now Keres, slight inaccuracy, plays queen d3. Both queen e2 and again d5 were more accurate. The problem with queen d3, it invites the freeing thrust c5, c4. Okay, now here Gligorich reacts promptly and accurately, protects the b5 pawn, drives the white queen back. Queen d2, and here Keres underestimated the equalizing potential of d6, d5. Did not consider was d5, and now e takes d5, e takes d4, knight takes d4, now bishop takes d5. And I think Keres no doubt calculated this position and probably figured, well, after knight df5, I have a promising attack. Queen g5 is in view, perhaps bishop a3 to trade off that dark squared bishop. Unfortunately, black seems to have a strong answer in g6. And then if knight h6 check looks very promising, black plays bishop takes, queen takes, and now the cheap shot, bishop takes g2. The point being, king takes g2, queen b7 check, wins that bishop on b2, black's a pawn up, white's king side is been damaged. Just to continue a little further, if white plays knight f5, then black rebuffs the attack with knight h5, covering the mate, and now the bishop's under on pre. White's position is collapsed. So it seems d5 would at least equalize here for black. All his pieces become activated and active and dangerous. Instead, he played the passive g6, and now Keres takes over. First, he puts that passive bishop to work on the a3 f8 diagonal. Primarily, that d6 square now is under white's intense glare. Gligorich responds logically, puts the rook into play, drives the bishop to a back to home base. He doesn't want to have that bishop standing out like a sore thumb on b7. And now Keres comes into demonstrates why he was a great middle game player. Just every move here has strong points behind it. Queen e3 now looks down on this diagonal. A little uncomfortable to have the queen opposite the rook, but the minor pieces are so huddled powerfully around that e4 pawn that is of very little impact. It's just a nice centralizing move, getting the queen ready to invade at a moment's notice to squares like a7 or b6. Or perhaps in the future, that queen may shift over to the king side. Let's see what happens. He plays logically, bishop g7, and white takes, immediately looking down on the d6 square. And now he takes the file, threatens to invade. Black has to deploy the bishop to f8. Every move now, white's making progress. Takes, rook takes, and now queen g5. Nice attacking spot for the queen. Black's tied up. Knight f5 is on the horizon. Basically, black's in serious trouble here. For instance, now if king h8 to stop knight f5, white can busily improve himself nicely with rook d2, followed by rook fd1. Let's go a little bit further. Knight g8, defensive move to kick that queen away. Rook bd1, f6, queen e3, and white has a massive advantage. Black can hardly move here. And white has ideas like h4, h5 to loosen up the black king side. He's got rook invasions, little Schemes like a4, a5 lurking, black's in big trouble. The game continuation was knight e8, passive, and that now it's matador defense. He lets the bull, or I should say the cow, to now charge into e7, pinning the knight. Black's that poor pinned knight. That must feel like a little insect in the collection, pinned multiple ways. Black's position is beyond repair now. Now, very elegant finish, very characteristic of Paul Keres. Knight g7. Okay, he has it all planned out here with knight f1. He wants to maneuver that knight to e3. Now, if rook f e8, relatively best, but pretty feeble, then white plays queen d6, queen takes, rook takes, and black is bound to lose that c4 pawn, or through by means of rook c6 takes c4, or rook b4 takes c4. Black can hardly move anything. And not to mention the knight on f1 is coming to e3 to devour the pawn on c4. So rook f8 was a slight improvement. Also, white, by the way, queen h4 is a strong alternative as well, as is queen b4. He tried knight e6, and now Keres says, I think he probably planned from here on to the final sequence. He had planned this at this moment. Knight e3, threatening knight d5, pretty much forced. King f1. That prevents knight e2 check. Now, he did have an excellent and crushing option here in knight g4. He didn't have to play king f1. The idea then is if knight e2 check, white wins with king f1, knight takes c3, and then knight g5, and black has absolutely no defense to knight h6 check. If knight takes d1, then, for instance, knight h6 check. King g7, knight e6 check is crushing. King takes h6. We don't take the queen. We deliver mate. A lot of other variations very similar to that one. So knight g4 here would be devastating. But king f1 also did the job, and led to a cute finish as well. f6, and here again, rook f e8. White has queen d6 as a strong answer, or queen b4. So he chose instead f6, hoping to defend by means of rook f7. But that now lost brutally to knight g4, knight d3. That was expected. Rook takes, pawn takes. He eliminates the black's best piece. Now he takes over this diagonal. And power of the pin and the power of a powerfully positioned attacking piece like that queen means now final long envisioned combo comes to fruition. Knight takes f6, threatening mate. Rook takes, knight g5. No escape from mate on h7 except for catastrophic material loss, and the game now concluded with some giveaway checks, spite checks, check, no thank you, and black resign. Very typical Paul Keres game. And another one I saw, this was also a very impressive effort. Our next example came about in an encounter with Wolfgang Unzicker, the German grandmaster, played in their match, the Ruy Lopez match from Hamburg, 1956. And Unzicker at that time was one of Germany's top players, a very solid elite level player. He never was a professional chess player. But a very tough customer, no doubt about it. I played him myself when he was in his advanced years, and I can certainly attest to his great instincts on the chessboard. And Unzicker also an expert here on the closed variation of the Ruy Lopez. So this was expert versus expert of the closed. Okay, and Unzicker always liked this is the basic Chigorin defense. I think that's what it's known as. Probably most are familiar with this. And here Keres goes with a4. A lot of people now prefer knight f1 over a4. A4 again, Keres wants to play on both sides of the board, create a target on the queen side, and put his rook to work. And Unzicker answers in a logical fashion, b4. He had great instincts with the Ruy Lopez. And Keres answers with b3, preparing to develop. Black develops a rook, attacks the bishop, which now retires. Looks like White's about to play bishop b2 and start getting his pieces finally developed, and then starting to play either on the center or the king side. But now Unzicker makes a bid for freedom, typical thematic answer to in the Ruy Lopez, and it's perfectly logical, good move. Temporary pawn sack is really what it is for activity. Okay, so now we get some mass exchanges. Black's a pawn down, but look at all that pressure. And Keres now self-pins, better than nothing. That's not going to be a fatal pin, but he's got to be very wary about that weak pawn on b3. And Unzicker plays all these correct-looking moves. Queen c6 is designed to now the queen is ready to deploy to e6 or g6 if necessary, and he attacks that rook, which is well placed. Keres always errs on the side of attack. Here that he has possible shots or pressure against g7 to keep black honest as far as not subtracting defenders who can become attackers from his kingside area. So he plays queen e6, now attacking the pawn on b3, logical move. He did have an option, perfectly good option though, in playing h5, slightly weakening of the black king area, but then White has a tough choice to make where to put the rook. If he plays rook g3, then Black can play queen e6, hitting the b3 pawn, and if rook b1, then rook c3 is very effective. Then b3 is surely going to drop, and Black has pressure now across the board. So after h5, White could then consider f4. But in that case, Black has probably a superior version of the game. For instance, queen d5 here looks like a reasonable move. Black has good compensation for the pawn. Anyway, the game continued. Queen e6, kind of a very unusual sequence coming up. Rook b1 guarding. Now he kicks, and White puts the rook on e4, where he guards e5. Now Black also has to worry a little bit about that pawn on b4. So now he goes queen g6. He's got it all worked out. Now both rooks are active on those C and D files. Looks like Keres is in some trouble. He comes up with a remarkable defense, combinative active defense. First of all, he gets his queen out from that D file, unpinning the bishop. But now Black plays rook d3, threatening rook takes f3 and the pawn on b3. What does White do? Plays king h1. Actually, king h2, slightly better move. But I can understand Keres's reluctance to put his king on a dark square, Usually the rule is if you have an enemy, the opponent has a dark squared bishop, it's advisable to put your king on a square not of the same color as the opponent's bishop. But in this case, king h2 would have worked a bit better, getting the king out from the first rank. Instead, he played king h1, and now Unzicker, long plan, gets his pawn back, and he has a tactic based on what appears to be Keres' back rank problem. Now, I think he must have gone into a deep think at this point and worked out the complications to his satisfaction and played bishop takes b4. Now, if bishop takes b4, rook takes b4, white's happy, pawn up. The knight on a5 is a bit out of play. It's also useful for white to have control over that g5 square, as that could give black some back rank problems of his own. That's big edge for white. But now Unzicker played instead rook c4. Now that looks very, very effective. And Keres had to take this into account when he played bishop takes b4. So now if rook takes c4, black plays rook takes b1, rook c8 check, king h7. And white has to give up his queen or lose a piece. Bishop takes a5, rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, and then something like queen e6 gives black the upper hand. Keres, though, had something up his sleeve, and that was rook takes b3. Amazing move, really. Rook takes e4. So now if the rook takes e4, if white plays rook e3, then of course he just takes on b4, blocks a piece up, easy win. So it looks like Keres has miscalculated spectacularly. Instead, it's actually Unzicker who's miscalculated. Here, Keres plays the astonishing queen b1. And this is a kind of a beautiful save, in my humble opinion. Now, here, Unzicker could have considered rook takes b4, rook takes, bishop takes b4, queen takes b4, but white just simply has an extra solid pawn, and Keres had intimidatingly strong technique. That's a sure death sentence. So that didn't look good, so what he goes ahead and plays knight takes b3. But then after bishop takes e7, the awful truth is now revealed. What to do with that hanging knight on b3? The knight on f3 covers e1. That's very helpful. The knight can't go anywhere. If he goes knight a5, white wins with queen b8 check, king h7, knight g5 check, winning the queen, not the rook, actually winning the queen. In view of king h6, queen h8 check, actually delivering mate. So here, and if queen e6 here, of course, queen takes rook wins. So black has that, he's got to give up that poor knight on b3. Game over. So the game now ended quickly. Knight rook takes a4, queen takes b3, and the rest is easy. And then black's king is too exposed. That g5 square in particular is a problem. He cannot bring the rook back for defensive purposes, so it's really over. He tried queen f5 to create a escape square and threatened queen f4 check. Keres alert to everything. e6, another nice finish, as I mentioned. Always great with the ruthless technical shots. Now, if queen takes e6, that leads to a knight fork. And f takes e6 leads to easy win with queen f8 check. queen b8 check rather, king h7, knight g7 check, king g6, queen e8 check, king h6, queen h8 check, king g6, queen h7, and mate. Typical Keres. And so he tried f6, and of course Keres easily found the shot. Bishop takes f6 to promote the e7 pawn, and here Unzicker resigned. Typical Paul Keres, and a guy, a great player. I highly recommend to all students of the game, especially those who want to study openings like the closed Ruy Lopez. Classical openings is really what I'm talking about. And that'll do it for this episode of Attack with Larry C. Thanks for joining me, and I invite you to join me in future investigations and looks at fine attacking play. Thank you.